Welcome back to Gentleman and Scholar. I'm your host, Joshua Houston, alone by myself today in the studio. Once again, we are coming out of quarantine here in Tennessee. We are starting to open back up. We've had 2 church services now where we've split the congregation in half and have an early service and a later service in the morning, and no other services throughout the week. We're still continuing to put up YouTube videos and things of that nature. We are doing the best that we can to get information out to you. I know some of you who listen and listen regularly expect this podcast to come out on the first of the month. We are 15 days behind, as a matter of fact, simply because there's just been so much going on that I haven't been able to get in here and get it recorded. Nobody's fault but my own. But we're coming at you now with some more on biblical scholarship and how to be a good Bible student, and how that's going to help you in your Christian walk and in your ministry and whatever situation of life you're in. That's what we're hoping with this podcast, that you become a Bible scholar. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a PhD or a master's degree in biblical studies. It just means we need to sit down with our Bible and look at it and look and see what it has to say, and read a couple books about that, and maybe we can interact with the material. That's what I'm hoping for. I'm hoping to teach us all how to interact with other material, whether it be things we agree with, things we don't agree with, how we can do that and come to an understanding together. Now, one thing that I wanted to talk about, and what we're going to talk about today, really doesn't have anything to do with that. If you are just a regular church member, someone who is not well read in biblical scholarship, or someone who is just starting to get your feet wet in biblical scholarship, today's episode may not be for you. And I know that's going to cost me some views, cost some listens and whatnot, but I'm not in it for that. I want to talk today about something that students have a big problem with. These are students that I have taught, and something that I've struggled with myself as a student, and I know many people as well have struggled with it. And that is what to do when you write a paper. So your first academic paper, or perhaps your second or third, or maybe even your 15th or 20th. Your academic papers are submitted to your professor, and then usually you will get the opportunity to present your paper. When you present your paper, there's a time afterwards of question and answers. Most of those will come from your professor, and then a smaller portion, a smaller fraction will come from those people who are in your class, your classmates, your peers, and perhaps even other professors who are not your actual professor, may be sitting on a panel, listening and waiting for their opportunity to get to evaluate your work. So the problem is not necessarily writing the paper. Those of us who have been involved in scholarship and been involved as a student and in school, we're well aware that paper writing is one of the things that we will have to do above most every other thing. So we write the papers, and we submit the papers, and we usually get our papers back before we present them. And in doing so, we have our professor's notes, and so we can kind of expect what to get from the professor. It's from our classmates and their perspective and their views, especially when you have classmates who don't agree with you on the premise of your paper. And this is true, honestly, when you're preaching. Those of you who are preachers, you can get up there and preach a sermon, but you're going to have people in the audience, most likely, who disagree or don't really understand where you're coming from. They don't agree with your premise on this particular topic, especially with the more controversial topics, namely things like let's say the Holy Spirit, your views on social injustice, views on the atonement of Jesus' sacrificial death, and things like that. There are going to be people who you're going to talk, and they're going to have that look on their face, or that confused look, like, what in the world's going on? What's happening? What are you talking about? Well, the same thing happens when you present a paper. And so I want to go over today, just really quickly, 5 suggestions that will help us when our paper gets torn apart. And I think these apply to sermons as well. When you have those dangerous foyer conversations, when you're out in the foyer shaking hands, and you have someone come up to you at the back, and they shake your hand and they say, "Brother, that was a great sermon, but I disagreed with you on this, this, and this." And you engage in that, and you engage in that conversation. The sermon does not end when you extend the invitation. and when you sing the invitation song, as most of us stereotypically do, at least in the churches of Christ. That's not when the sermon ends. Now, the sermon isn't over until you get in the truck and go on. Or your car or whatever vehicle you so drive. I just happen to drive a truck. So here are some 5 suggestions on how we can engage in discussion, be it in a paper, a scholarly setting, or perhaps even in a ministerial setting. So suggestion number 1 is to do the work. Put in the research. There are a lot of preachers and a lot of scholars, a lot of students who will basically copy and paste their sermon or their paper. They're going to look at what other people have done, and they're just going to pass that off as their own work. You can't do that. That's called plagiarism. We don't want to do that. We want to put in our own work. We want to make it our own thesis. We want to give our own research and our own opinion. So what that means is you have to do the work. You have to do the research. And upon doing that, you will grow in your knowledge. The very first book that I wrote was an adaptation of my master's thesis, which was on fasting. And the title is simply Should Christians Fast? And if you're interested in purchasing that, you can find it on Amazon. There's a link in the description. Sorry for the plug. But it's called Should Christians Fast? And my question was simply that. Should Christians today be involved in the practice of fasting? Because in my culture, in my growing up scenario, we did not do that. Fasting was not something that we did. So I took that question with the expectation that I would say, no, Christians don't need to fast. It's something that was popular in the Old Testament. Jesus did it as a practice, and some of the people in the early church did it, but it's really never commanded, and therefore we shouldn't do it. However, upon doing the research, upon doing the work, my thesis stayed the same, which was we are going to evaluate this from a historical, cultural, and theological standpoint, but my conclusion changed. My conclusion changed from saying, no, we don't need to actually, spoiler alert for the book, yes, Christians should be involved in this. Now, you'll have to read the book to find out why that is, at least according to my own research. But that is something that was established based on doing the work. So, step number 1, put in the work, put in the time, put in the research. And what that means is you have to be disciplined in order to do the research. You can't just start a paper or start a sermon the night before it's due. In undergrad especially, I had roommates and friends who would start their research paper that was due on Sunday afternoon at 2 o'clock after they got done with Sunday afternoon lunch. And they would finish it and they'd get like a B or a C on it, and that was good enough for them. I know preachers who start their sermons for Sunday, Saturday evening at 5 o'clock. You can't do that. I'm sorry. If you're listening to this and you're one of those people, please stop. Just please stop. Start your research for your sermon Monday morning. Carry it on. Make a schedule. We've talked about this on the podcast before. Make a schedule. Be time conscious, but put in the work and make sure that you're willing to do that. Number 2 is to stick to your thesis. So it's really easy whenever your paper starts getting torn apart, your professor, your classmates, the people in your congregation, whatever, they start tearing apart your work and they start nitpicking. Well, the easy thing to do is to say, well, the professor knows more than I do, so I'm going to change my view to the professor's view. Listen to me. Your professors want you to have your own opinion. Now, they want your opinion to be right. They want your opinion to be grounded. They want your opinion to be rooted in good research. But you may walk away from that disagreeing with your professor. And that's fine. That's fine, as long as what you've done is adequate research. So when you make your thesis or when you make your sermon topic, whatever it is, be sure to stick to it. For example, I'm preaching this coming Sunday on the Holy Spirit. I've started a sermon series on the Holy Spirit. And we're going to be discussing the personality of the Holy Spirit and the ability of the Holy Spirit to have emotion. There are some people in our congregation who do not believe that the Holy Spirit is an active entity, that he is a part of the Godhead who is sent out by God, and that basically he is a servant of God the Father. Well, my thesis is not so. My thesis is basically saying that the Holy Spirit has the freedom and the ability to feel and to act out of emotion. And so when that thesis is given, I have to stick to that. I wrote a paper not too long ago on animal worship in ancient Egypt. Because the ancient Egyptians, and other ancient cultures for that matter, they worshipped animals because they believed that their gods had qualities of animals. And my thesis was, if they are worshiping animals at a time when animal domestication is on the rise, who really are they worshiping? Because if they are on the rise, if animal domestication is on the rise, then that puts humans over animals, as superior to animals, and yet they're worshiping these animals. It just seems hypocritical. It seems cyclical, or circular reasoning, and so on and so forth. Well, I have to stick to that thesis whenever someone says, well, what about this, that, and the other? So stick to your thing. And if you've done the work, as we said, suggestion number 1, it should be relatively easy to stick to your thesis. So suggestion number 3 then is, going along with that, is to know your material. When I submitted my thesis for my master's degree, which was on fasting, I did not know the material, even though I'd done the research, even though I wrote this 100-page paper. I did not know the material as well as I should have when I defended my thesis, because I had 3 professors who are all PhDs and who all do this for a living, and they grilled me mercilessly. They grilled me on my paper. Well, what do you mean by this? The usage of this Greek word, and how would you explain the syntax of this passage, and how does Matthew 6 involve in this tripartite type thing where it's, the hypocrites do this, but you should do this. How does all that fit in? And I think I was able to articulate my argument pretty well. But there was one question where I had one professor say, no, you are absolutely wrong on this. You need to go back and reevaluate this, and we're going to accept your thesis, but this part you need to really reevaluate before you publish or promote this thesis. So if you know your material, which brings me to number 4, and I know we're moving quickly through this, but each one of these kind of is joined together with each one. If you know your material, then you should also, number 4, know material that is not included in your paper or in your sermon. Which goes back to number 1, do the work, do the research. So the material that's not included, when you are having these discussions, or when you're defending your thesis, when you're defending your paper, when you're defending your sermon, the material that you don't include is going to come out in that defense, because you can't just say what you said already. They know what you said. They know what you've written. They know what you've put in. Now comes the time where you have to start talking about what you've done, what you've said, what you've learned in your other research. So that's when that comes out. When you know your material, then that implies that you know material that you haven't included. What a lot of people like to do, and especially a lot of undergrads and those in master's programs, that this becomes a little bit less in my experience in PhD programs, but nonetheless, you will do a quick Google search or a search on Google Scholar or something like that, and you will find a quote that fits your particular thesis. You'll cut the quote out and put it in there. That quote may not be the understanding of the actual author of the quote. So you're taking it out of context. And of course, that is the thing that we as Bible scholars don't want to do with the Bible, especially if we're believing Bible scholars. We don't want to do that. We want to read the Bible in its context. And so we don't want to take anything out of context. But there in our papers, we often take things out of context and misrepresent, misuse those things. Now, if you have read the entire paper, or if you've read the entire book, or you've read the entire article, or whatever, then you have the ability to go back and say, well, yes, but scholar so-and-so said this about this, and I think that was a good point, and so I didn't include that in my paper, but now in our discussion, I can bring that up, and I can include that. And so, lastly, suggestion number 5 is to admit that you don't know the answer. This is very difficult to do in scholarship. It's very difficult to do in ministry, because people come to, let's talk about ministry first. People come to the minister expecting the minister to know everything, to have all the answers to life, to have all the secrets figured out. And so when you preach a sermon on X, Y, and Z, and someone has a problem with that, or they don't quite understand, and they come to you asking you questions, It is okay for you to say, I'm not really sure about how to answer that question. I have something working in my mind right now, but I'm afraid to give it to you because I just honestly don't know. Let me go back. Let me look at it. Let me see what others have to say. Let me do the research. Let me look in the Bible. Let's see what the Bible has to say further about this, and I'll get back to you. That's perfectly fine. And I think more preachers need to do that, but we are so caught up in thinking that we should be the ones to have all the answers that we give half an answer and try to pass that off as acceptable when we really can't. In the same way, if you are in school and you have a professor who asks you a question, it's okay to say, you know what, I hadn't really thought about it from that angle, and I would like to go back and do more research on that. And if you would allow me, maybe in our next class meeting, I could have a discussion with you or have a discussion with the class over my findings and what I've concluded. And maybe all of us together can come to a conclusion that would be acceptable in this particular scenario. It's okay to admit that you don't have all the answers and that you may not know everything that you need to know in order to promote your thesis or whatever. You've done the work. You have been able to quote and pull from other sources, and that's well and good. But you may not know everything, and the ability to admit that shows humility, and it shows your willingness to keep on going in that particular instance. Let me warn you, though. Don't use that as a crutch. Don't use the I don't know as a crutch. I've been in PhD seminars for over a year now, which I know isn't very long, and there's some of you listening who've been in PhD seminars for a long time. Some of you even have your PhD, and that's wonderful. But from what I've learned in my PhD seminars is there are several PhD students who use the I don't know excuse as a way out of the question. You say, well, I'm not familiar with that. I don't know. I hadn't thought about it that way, and maybe I need to look it up and go back. And your professor is forced at that point to say, well, since you don't know, then we need to drop the discussion. Because there's no way you can engage in meaningful conversation if you don't know. So we pass it off. I want to warn against that. We as academic students or as ministers, which I would claim ministry is an academic study, we need to be willing to at least engage in the discussion. We may not know, we may not have all the answers, but we at least need to engage in the discussion. So hopefully we can do that. So here, just as a review, here are 5 suggestions for when your sermon or your paper gets torn apart by your audience. And the audience may be a congregation, your audience may be an academic setting, whatever it is. I'm gearing up. I had said earlier, I believe it was in February or March, that I was going to present a paper in Knoxville at Johnson University. Coronavirus hit and that got canceled. It's been rescheduled for September the 11th. So we're looking forward to that. And so these things are at the forefront of my mind right now because this is going to happen. There's a question and answers session at the end of your paper presentation, and I'm expecting my paper to get really, really ripped apart. So step number 1, do the work, do the research. Step number 2, stick to your thesis. Somebody gives you a question that goes against your thesis, stick to your thesis. Make sure to stick to what you've had. Don't say something like, well, I've never thought about it that way, so I need to change my thesis. No, you've committed to your thesis, and only change your thesis if it demands it. So stick to your thesis. And number 3, know your material. You've done the work. Know your material, which leads to number 4, know the material that you haven't included in your paper or in your sermon. Be able to quote or to draw from other things that you hadn't included in the particular writing. And number 5, admit you don't know the answer. That's okay. Not knowing the answer is perfectly fine, and I think more academics and more preachers need to have the humility to say, I don't know. Well, this has been a relatively short episode, and the reason for that is, first of all, I'm by myself, and it's just me here talking about some things that I've been thinking about here for the past couple of months. Again, sorry we didn't have it out on June 1st, but we'll be back July 1st, Lord willing, and we'll be talking about some other things that pertain to ministry and scholarship together as we try to be ministers and scholars, and we try to promote Jesus in an academic setting. I hope that you have enjoyed this. I hope you'll subscribe. I hope you'll subscribe to Coffee and Christ on YouTube. If this is the domain where you're listening, you'll subscribe on Anchor Podcast, A Gentleman and Scholar. And we're trying to start up our blog again. For some reason, our blog Scholars Corner has been cut off, and so I'm trying to get the kinks worked out there where we can have that. You can find my books on Amazon under Joshua Seth Houston in the book section, or the link in the description of the YouTube video if you're watching on YouTube or listening on YouTube. So hopefully you will do that, and look forward to our next time together. This has been Gentleman and Scholar. I'm your host, Joshua Houston.